What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Craft Workshop video. This week's video is the first part in a series I'm going to be doing on building out this new shop space. In this first part, I'm going to cover all of the framing work we've done. When I took over this space, it was totally empty. I'm also going to go over some of my kind of design process and my plans for the space, that kind of thing. But as you can hear, this room is super echoey as it stands right now, which is something I'll be working on later in this series. Let's go ahead and get started with the video.
Let's rewind a little bit and I'll show you how this space looked when I took it over. So first of all, since a lot of you are asking, I'm moving my shop into this space because my wife and I recently moved into a new house with a pretty small garage, and I obviously need space for what I do. Anyway, the new space needed a lot of work when I took it over. There was weird paint on the wall, a really flimsy partition wall in the middle of the space, and there were also no lights and about 3 outlets in total. So there was obviously a lot to do, and my first step after finding the space and deciding to rent it was to hop into SketchUp and lay out the space. So in total, I have about 1,500 square feet with a 19-foot by 79-foot footprint, and there's a bathroom at the back of the space, and the ceilings are 13 feet tall. The plan is to divide the space with a partition wall towards the front, which will separate the front office and photo area from the shop space. Once I had the layout basically done, I could move on to the actual build out. And the first step was to demo all of the existing structures to give myself a nice blank slate to work on. And this went pretty quickly, and we were able to salvage a lot of this material for use during the framing part of the build out. And luckily, almost everything was put together with screws, so we were able to take things apart pretty quickly. Also, when I say we, I mean myself and my buddy Justin, who is a licensed general contractor and helped me with this entire build out. And you'll be seeing a lot of him in these videos, so I figured I'd go ahead and introduce him. Once the demo work was done, next came the delivery of the materials for the framing, and I worked with 84 Lumber, who's the sponsor of this week's video, on the materials for this part of the project, and I'm so glad I did. I was able to stop by my local 84 Lumber and talk with them about the material options they had available, and got a quote from them the same day. And unfortunately, I don't have a large door leading into this shop space, so after 84 Lumber dropped off the materials, Justin and I had to move them into the space by hand. And this went pretty quickly and also allowed us to get things organized for the framing process. So the next day, we got to work framing, and this process went pretty quickly, although this was my first time ever framing, so I had a lot to learn. And rather than try to get a ton of detail shots when framing out this first sidewall, I decided to kind of just let the camera run on time-lapse mode and soak up some knowledge from Justin. And after finishing that first wall, I felt like I had the process down a lot better and well enough to get some detail shots so I could show you guys the process we followed. So starting on the other side wall, first we would set up a line laser roughly 4 inches off the wall. And the extra ½ inch of clearance between the concrete wall and the 2x4 wall would allow us to work around any inconsistencies in the concrete wall, which there were a ton of, and we could still maintain plumb in all our new walls. After getting the line laser set up, we would make marks on the floor just to indicate where to hold the chalk line, since we'd kind of be blocking it when holding the chalk line, and then we could snap the chalk line along the entire length of the wall from front to back. And we would work back in sections when doing this so that the chalk line stayed nice and taut. Next, we could get to framing the first wall section. And we were building these walls in 12-foot sections, but we cut this first wall section to 11 feet 5 inches to offset the last stud from the end of the wall section. And this would allow us to have a consistent 16-inch on center stud spacing along the entire wall and have a relatively even spacing of the studs from the ends of each wall section. To mark off the stud locations on this first wall, we pulled the tape from the end of the top plate and made a mark at 1.5 inches for the first stud. And the next mark was at 15 1/4, which is where the left edge of the stud needed to fall to get the 16-inch on center spacing we were after. So we continued down the top plate, making marks 3/4 of an inch back from each stud center, which are indicated on most tape measures with big red numbers, so they're really easy to lay out. So after marking the stud locations, we transferred the mark to the bottom plate. We also marked a square reference line across both plates with a speed square, and also marked an X to indicate which side of the line the stud would fall on. With the stud locations marked out, we could start laying out the wall section. And I flipped up the top and bottom plate, facing our marks towards the inside, and then started placing studs. And when placing the studs, I made sure to crown them, which meant I was checking to see which way the studs curved along their edge. And we faced the crowned edge towards the floor, so that we wouldn't have to fight the crown when putting the stud wall against the concrete wall later. Also, these studs aren't crowned as bad as they look, the floor is just that uneven. After crowning all the boards, we could get the wall assembled. We used 3-inch screws for pretty much all the framing, and these screws are incredibly strong and drive really easily, no pre-drilling or anything like that. When assembling these walls on my less than flat floors, I found it made things a lot easier to partially drive in the screws before attaching the stud. This left my other hand free to hold the pieces in place while fully driving in the screws. And we would start at each end of the wall, fastening the 4 corners together, then we would go back and attach the rest of the studs in the middle of the wall. After getting all the studs attached, we marked out the location for our blocking, which we added at 8 foot and 1/4 inch from the bottom of the wall section, and this would allow us to use this blocking as a nailer when attaching the plywood and drywall to the walls later. Also, when installing blocking, we would add 2 pieces, skip 1, add 2 pieces, skip 1, etc. And this allowed us to check the stud spacing before installing the rest of the blocking to make sure the blocking wasn't causing the wall to bow out along its width. And this could be the case if the studs are especially bowed, or if you just cut your blocking inaccurately. So after checking this measurement, we would install the rest of the blocking and then could get the wall section stood up. And when standing up the wall, we would make sure the bottom plate was in line with the chalk line we snapped earlier, and on this first wall section, we made sure it was butted up against the existing wall corner. To fasten the wall sections to the floor and walls, we used these enormous Titan 2 masonry screws, and thankfully Justin had an SDS drill for us to use during this process because we had to drill 1 3/4 inches deep into the concrete for each of these screws. And we got in a pretty good rhythm here considering how many times we had to do this, and Justin would man the SDS drill and I would be on vacuum duty, and then I would drive in the screw once the hole was drilled. And I would definitely recommend some sort of dust control here because drilling into concrete creates a ton of fine dust that you really don't want to be breathing, and it'll also kind of mess up the bit over time. As you can see here, occasionally the bottom plate would be slightly out of whack, so we just use a pry bar to keep it in line with the chalk line while drilling the hole and driving in the screw. So after getting the bottom plate attached to the floor, we could trust that the wall wasn't going to fall over on top of us, so next we could check the wall for plumb. This was extremely simple with the line laser, which you'll see a lot during this project. So to check for plumb, we would mark a center line on one of the studs at the top and bottom, line up the laser with the bottom center mark, and then see how far off the laser was from the top center mark. And getting this first wall section plumb really kind of dictated the rest of the walls, so we really took our time here. And on this particular section, we were able to just shim the wall section against the concrete wall to get it plumb. So to attach the top part of the wall sections to the concrete, we would add 2 pieces of 2x4 blocking, and then we could drive screws through the stud into the blocking to fasten the wall in place. And once again, the SDS drill was utilized to drill 2 holes into the concrete, and then I could drive in 2 more screws. And since these wall sections stood off the concrete about 1 inch at the top, we would add a second piece of blocking on top of the first just to give us more material to screw into. To make sure the wall was plumb in this kind of in and out direction, we would set up another line laser 3 inches off of the bottom plate, and then we could check this measurement at the top plate, get it dead on, and then drive in a few screws through the sides of one of the studs into the blocking. And after getting the first area attached, we would move down 2 studs and repeat the process all over again, checking for plumb the entire length of the wall section. And since the side-to-side plumb alignment was pretty much locked in after that first section, we were really just checking for plumb in the kind of in and out direction from that point on, so things did go a lot quicker. And we just kept repeating this process until we got that wall section fully secured, and let me tell you, these walls are not going anywhere, they are rock solid. With the first section in place, we could just repeat the process for the second section. On this section, we cut the top and bottom plate to exactly 12 feet or 144 inches, and then to mark the stud locations, we pulled the measurement off of the studs from the previous wall section. And this made sure that any inconsistencies between the sections wouldn't throw off our stud spacing along the length of the wall. Also, when marking the studs on this wall section, we could mark them right at 16 inches, 32 inches, etc., without having to measure back 3/4 inch, since we were pulling the tape off of the edge of the previous stud. The only kind of unique piece of this wall section was this stud pocket, which is where the partition wall that runs across the width of the shop is attached. And this stud pocket is essentially 3 studs connected in a U shape, and this just provides a place to attach the perpendicular wall later on. After building the stud pocket, we could lay it out on the top and bottom plates, then transfer the rest of the stud locations before moving on to building the wall section. And this process went exactly the same as the last section, except that some of the blocking pieces needed to be cut a little shorter to account for the stud pocket. Attaching the wall to the floor was also the same process, just drilling the holes with the SDS and driving the masonry screws. To attach the wall sections to each other at the top plate, we used another piece of blocking. And when attaching this piece of blocking, we checked the new wall section for plumb in the kind of side-to-side direction, and made any necessary adjustments by cutting the piece of blocking longer or shorter. And after getting the new section plumb side to side, we just repeated the process of attaching the wall section to the concrete wall with more blocking, and then now that we were past where the partition wall attached, we could go ahead and work on that. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the partition wall will separate the front office area from the shop. And this wall will be floor to ceiling, whereas these other walls have only been 10 feet or 12 feet high. So we decided to build this wall in place rather than building it on the floor and trying to stand it up. First, we set up a line laser perpendicular with the stud pockets we created earlier, and marked out where the edge of the top plate would land on the ceiling. We also made marks up the stud pocket vertically just to make sure our walls would be perfectly plumb. Next, we snapped a chalk line where the bottom plate would sit, and after cutting 2 pieces for the bottom plate, we could start laying out where everything would go. The first thing to lay out was another stud pocket, which is where the outside wall of the office would meet the partition wall, and we made this at 8 feet since the office would be 8 feet deep. The next thing to lay out was the location of the door leading from the front area into the shop. And let's take a second to look at how a door is framed in case you don't know, because I didn't, and more specifically, let's look at how we framed this particular door. On the outside of the door framing, you've got the king stud, which runs the full height of the wall. And on the inside of the king stud is the jack stud, which runs from the bottom plate to the header. The header in our case was just 2 pieces of 2x4 stacked together, but this will depend on your local code and how big your door or window is, and whether your wall is load bearing. Above the header are what's called cripples, which are basically the remaining parts of the studs that would have run where your doorway was placed. And as you can see on the left side of the door, the rightmost stud of the stud pocket is acting as the king stud here. So back to the actual work, after getting everything laid out on the bottom plate, one tip I got from Justin was to cut about halfway through the bottom plate where the inside edge of the jack stud is located. And this section is removed when installing the door later, and it's much easier to do this without having to cut all the way down to the floor, which could damage the floor or your tool or blade, depending on what they're made of. Next, we could fasten the bottom plate to the floor in the same way as with the previous wall sections, making sure the pieces stayed aligned with our chalk line. And we fastened the top plate to the ceiling using similar concrete screws and lined up the top plate with the marks we had made previously when using the line laser. To transfer our measurements from the bottom plate to the top plate, we again called on the line laser, and I would line up the laser with one end of the lines, and Justin would transfer that mark to the top plate using a square to bring the line across. And this meant I didn't have to try and perfectly align the laser with the entire line, just one end of it. To determine the length of the studs here, I used another type of laser, a laser measure, and pulling a tape between the top and bottom plate here was pretty tricky, and this laser measure was incredibly accurate, which we confirmed a few times with an actual tape measure. And as expected, these measurements changed across the floor since the floor wasn't level, so every stud had to be cut to length. And while Justin cuts the studs to length, let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, 84 Lumber. 84 Lumber is a leading supplier of building materials and building supplies for single and multifamily residences and commercial buildings. And I worked with my local 84 Lumber store to work out a bill of materials for this project, and they delivered the materials on time and were extremely easy to work with. And 84 Lumber isn't just for building professionals and commercial contractors either. They're happy to work with do-it-yourselfers like you and me. So to learn more about 84 Lumber and find a location near you, visit 84lumber.com or click the link in the video description below, and thanks again to 84 Lumber for sponsoring this week's video. Once the boards were cut to length, we could start putting the wall together. And first we added the stud pocket where the office wall would attach to the partition wall, and then we could start adding the rest of the door framing, starting with the king stud. As you can see, we had to toenail these studs in place, and another tip Justin gave me here was to drive in a few screws partially just to help keep the board in place before driving the screws all the way in. Next, we could attach the jack studs by screwing them to the king studs as well as to the bottom plate. With the jack studs in place, we could attach the header, which again is just two 2x4s screwed together. Once the header was in place, we could add the cripples, starting with the cripples on either side. And the reason to add these first is so that you have room to add screws without the other studs getting in your way. After adding the rest of the cripples and finishing the door framing, we could move on to the rest of the studs, starting with the stud against one of the sidewalls. We could then continue working our way down the wall, filling in the rest of the studs, and the only other thing to add after getting the studs installed was more blocking at 8 feet, which we did later off camera. So with the partition wall done, we could move on to framing out the office, and this was mostly the same process as before, but we did use the 3-4-5 method to ensure the two office walls were square to each other. To use this method here, we pulled a diagonal measurement of 10 feet from the corner of the office wall and marked this with a block of 2x4, and we knew the office wall was 8 feet from the side wall, so all we needed to do was make sure the other end of the bottom plate was 6 feet from the block of 2x4, and that would ensure the corner was square. So again, we use 6 feet, 8 feet, and 10 feet as our measurements here, which are just multiples of 3, 4, and 5. So we marked that location once we found it, and then snapped a line where that wall would be installed. Next, we laid out the stud locations on the two office walls, and this was pretty much more of the same process, laying out the door and the studs, and the only big difference here was the corner where the two office walls met. The corner consists of 3 pieces of 2x4 stacked together, with the centerpiece being made up of shorter blocking pieces, which helps to use up some scrap. And this triple layered 2x4 will give plenty of meat to attach the perpendicular walls together, but will also provide a place to attach the wall covering later, which is plywood in my case. After getting that wall done, we added another stud pocket to the left side wall, and then laid out the shorter office wall, which was just a simple stud wall with no real special layout. Finally, we could stand up the walls and get them attached to the other walls as well as to the floor. And I realize this is a terrible angle of this process, so I apologize, but hopefully you can see how that outside corner provides a place for the shorter office wall to connect to the longer office wall. The last bit of framing to do in the front area was the office ceiling. The first board to cut here was the ledger, which is what the ceiling joist would attach to on the sidewall. And since Justin's miter saw didn't have the cut capacity for these larger boards, I pulled out my track saw, and it actually worked really great for this. To hang the ledger board, we set the board against the top plate of the office wall on one end, and then used the line laser to get a measurement which we can mark at the other end to ensure the ledger was level. Now, this was kind of a weird process because we knew the floor wasn't level, so we were going to be out of level in some direction, but we decided to make the ceiling level along the long side, and that ended up working out pretty much fine. So speaking of which, this problem came up again when installing the other ledger board, as the angle of the floor caused there to be a gap at the bottom of the board on Justin's side, which was pushing my end of the board too far out at the top plate of the office wall. So to fix this, we scribed the line and cut a slight angle on the end of the ledger board using the track saw. With the angle cut, the board fit pretty much perfectly, and we could fasten the ledger to the partition wall. The next two boards to add were the band boards, which essentially create the rest of the frame for the joists. And these boards sit on the outside edges of the top plate and are attached to each other, to the top plates, and to the existing walls. So after installing the second band board, we marked out the joist locations, which should fall above the studs below, and then we could start installing the joists. To attach the joists, I screwed through the band board on my side, and Justin toe-nailed the joists in place temporarily on his side. Once the joists were placed, we came back and added joist hangers to permanently attach the joist to the ledger board. And when adding joist hangers, you use 2 different lengths of nails. The shorter nails attach the joist hanger to the ledger board, and the longer nail attaches diagonally through the end of the joist into the ledger. Also, I find this clip pretty funny, watching me struggle to get 2 of these joist hangers installed in the same time Justin got 4 installed. I guess I need to work on my hammer skills a little bit. The last board to add to the office was a nailer in between that last joist and the band board, and this will just give us a place to attach the plywood ceiling later on. And with that, the office and partition wall were finished, so all that was left to do was finish framing the rest of the sidewall. And this was just more of the same process as before, marking lines on the floor, building wall sections, attaching them to the floor, attaching them to the previous wall section, and then attaching them to the concrete wall. This was all the same repetitive process until we got to the very end where we needed to create a short wall section to finish out the wall. So at the end of this wall, we added an L-shaped stud section, which meant we didn't need 2 studs right next to each other, and this also made running the electrical through that area to the panel later much easier. And with that, the framing in this new shop was complete.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. It is really, really exciting to see this space start to come to life. Obviously, I had never done any framing prior to doing this work, so it's been a huge learning experience for me, but it's really cool to be in this space now versus even 2 weeks ago when we got started. So the next video will be covering electrical, lighting, and installing soundproofing installations. So if you guys want to see that and continue to keep up with this series, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that little notification bell so you don't miss those videos. I'm planning to try to put these out about once a week, but it might be a little bit longer between videos just depending on how this whole process goes. Thanks again for watching, everybody. I will see you in the next part, and until next time, happy building.